I knew my time at Aegis Dynamics was officially over the moment. Julian Miller refused to make direct eye contact. He was 34 years old, freshly appointed as our Vice President of Software Strategy, smelling faintly of expensive citrus cologne and heavy corporate ambition. He sat across from me in his plush leather executive chair, leaning back with a posture that suggested he had personally built the enterprise from the ground up. Across from his polished mahogany desk sat 54-year-old Chief Systems Architect Gavin Vance, me. For 22 long years, I had designed, written, and maintained the foundational predictive database engine that powered every single transaction across our global network. I had been here when Aegis Dynamics was nothing more than 3 desks in a damp basement office with flickering lights and folding chairs. Now, this young executive held my annual review folder in his manicured hands, flipping through the pages like a diner menu he had already decided to reject. Julian did not open the meeting with a courteous greeting, nor did he acknowledge the 2 decades of relentless sweat equity I had poured into the company. Instead, he flashed a thin, polished corporate smile, the kind that stays strictly on the lips and never reaches the eyes, and declared that we needed to discuss operational alignment. Alignment was his favorite buzzword, a sanitized managerial phrase designed to justify clearing out veteran engineers who understood the system's complexities in order to hire younger, cheaper coders who would never push back against impossible deadlines. He informed me that while my historical contributions were duly noted, the company was aggressively pivoting toward a streamlined, agile workflow. In his view, my insistence on exhaustive quality control, stress testing, and backward compatibility was slowing down our quarterly deployment velocity. Julian tapped his gold fountain pen against my file, looking at me as if I were an outdated piece of office equipment that had outlived its usefulness. He explained that modern software companies needed to move fast and break things, whereas my engineering philosophy belonged to a bygone era of cautious infrastructure design. He complained about my refusal to authorize rapid feature releases without thorough security audits, claiming that my risk-averse mindset was undermining our competitive edge in the market. As he spoke, his tone grew increasingly condescending, oozing with the unearned arrogance of someone who had never written a single line of production code in his life. He pulled up a digital chart on his tablet, displaying a series of colorful graphs created by external management consultants. The charts purported to show that our engineering overhead was 30% higher than industry benchmarks, recommending an immediate reduction in senior architectural staff. Julian pointed to the red line on the graph and noted that legacy positions were consuming resources that could otherwise be allocated to market expansion and executive compensation pools. He spoke about software as if it were a commodity that could be assembled by interchangeable workers, completely failing to understand that our system's predictive accuracy was the result of 2 decades of mathematical refinement and careful data structuring. I watched him gesture dramatically, realizing that to people like Julian, software development was nothing more than a series of slides in a pitch deck. He had no understanding of algorithmic efficiency, concurrency control, or cryptographic security. He believed that proprietary platforms grew on trees, and that senior architects were merely overpriced managers who oversaw automated code generators. His ignorance was staggering, yet he spoke with the absolute authority of a man who believed his business school degree elevated him above the laws of logic and engineering. Then came the exact sentence he had undoubtedly practiced in front of his bathroom mirror before driving his luxury sedan to work. He looked up from my file, adjusted his silk tie, and scoffed that if I was not happy with the new strategic direction, the door was right there. He leaned back, resting his elbows on the chair arms, fully expecting me to panic, to plead for my position, or perhaps to launch into an emotional speech about loyalty and sacrifice. My mind flashed back to the brutal early years of the startup. I remembered staying awake for 48 consecutive hours during our initial platform launch, surviving on vending machine potato chips and lukewarm drip coffee while manually patching memory leaks to prevent our servers from melting down. I remembered missing my sister's wedding anniversary because a botched database migration threatened to erase 5 million customer records. I remembered personally mentoring every senior engineer currently working in our department, instilling in them the principle that system integrity must always take precedence over executive vanity. I remembered standing alongside our founder, Howard Vance, when Aegis Dynamics was fighting off aggressive hostile takeover bids, working 80-hour weeks to ensure our core platform remained secure and independent. I had sacrificed personal relationships, vacation time, and my own physical health to build the foundation of this $780 million software empire. And now, this 34-year-old executive was handing me a polite termination notice as if my 22 years of dedication amounted to nothing more than legacy overhead. I looked around his office, noting the expensive artwork on the walls and the panoramic view of the downtown financial district, amenities that had been financed entirely by the revenue generated by my predictive engine. Julian sat there with an expectant look, waiting for me to react, to display anger, or to beg for a severance package. He believed he held all the cards, completely unaware that his authority was an illusion built on top of software he did not own. Instead of exploding with anger or begging for my livelihood, a profound and icy calm washed over my chest. I stared at Julian Miller, taking in the self-satisfied smirk that revealed how confident he felt in his position of newfound authority. I did not raise my voice. I did not utter a single word of complaint or defense. I simply reached forward, smoothly folded down the lid of my company-issued laptop, and placed it inside my leather briefcase. I stood up calmly, buttoned my suit jacket, and locked eyes with him for 3 long seconds until his confident smile began to fray around the edges. Without saying a word, I turned on my heel and walked out of his corner office, leaving him sitting alone in his glass tower. I walked down the long carpeted hallway, past the glass-walled conference rooms where junior developers were crammed around whiteboard tables, completely oblivious to the fact that the foundational architect of their entire codebase was exiting the building. I passed Nancy, our veteran lead quality assurance analyst, who gave me a subtle, knowing nod from her cubicle, as if she had already sensed the toxicity brewing behind Julian's closed doors. Nobody in the department said a word, and that heavy, oppressive silence carried a grim gravity. It swept away 22 years of shared late-night victories, technical triumphs, and professional dedication, discarding them into the corporate trash heap. But what Julian Miller and his executive peers failed to realize was that in high-stakes technology management, quiet compliance is not surrender. Quiet compliance is execution strategy. I did not drive straight to my suburban home after leaving the corporate parking structure. Instead, I drove 3 miles down the coastal highway to a quiet, classic diner where the booths were lined with faded red vinyl and the coffee was served hot and black. I sat in a booth near the corner window, watching the late afternoon traffic crawl along the freeway while the quiet humming of the refrigerator filled the background. Aegis Dynamics had consumed more than 2 decades of my life. I had watched the firm transform from an underfunded software venture into a $780 million market leader. Every core algorithm, every data parsing routine, and every emergency fail-safe mechanism in their flagship product suite bore my distinct intellectual signature. They believed they owned every line of code that had ever left my keyboard, but they had completely forgotten the legal foundation upon which the company had been constructed. As I sipped my black coffee, I reflected on the reality of corporate loyalty. In the modern tech industry, executives love to lecture employees about commitment, passion, and treating the company like a family. But the moment quarterly profit margins dip or executive bonuses are threatened, that family dynamic vanishes into thin air. They view engineers as disposable cogs in a machine, easily replaced by cheaper labor once the initial architecture has been constructed. But while Julian Miller viewed himself as a master strategist, he possessed zero knowledge regarding the historical legal structure of our core intellectual property. I recalled the specific legal maneuvers we executed during the early days of the company. In the fast-paced tech world, young startups often make sloppy legal assumptions, failing to properly document property transfers, or assuming that general employment contracts cover proprietary inventions. created prior to corporate incorporation. Aegis Dynamics had made precisely that mistake, relying on informal handshakes and vague promises of future equity while I did the actual heavy lifting of writing the core codebase. When I finally arrived home around 6 o'clock, the house was dark and quiet. My cat Atlas, a calm gray shorthair, greeted me at the entryway threshold with a soft meow, sensing the shift in my routine. I set my briefcase on the hallway table, poured 2 fingers of small batch bourbon into a heavy glass, and walked down to my home office at the back of the house. In the corner of the room stood a heavy fireproof steel safe that had remained sealed for nearly 5 years. I knelt on the wooden floor, spun the mechanical dial through its 3-part combination, and pulled open the heavy steel door with a firm tug. Inside, resting beneath yellowed tax documents and old house deeds, was a thick manila folder sealed with official notary stamps. That folder contained the original provisional patent application for our core predictive engine, filed in July of 2011 under federal registration number 79,864,322. Back in 2011, Aegis Dynamics was teetering on the brink of insolvency and could not afford the substantial legal fees required to retain a corporate intellectual property firm. My longtime personal friend and IP attorney, Walter Jennings, had advised me to file the provisional patent under my personal name as the primary inventor and sole owner, allowing the company to use the technology under a temporary licensing agreement until formal funding was secured. To protect both the startup and my personal work, Walter had drafted a conditional licensing contract between Aegis Dynamics and myself. Embedded deep within Section 9, Subclause D of that document was a precise, non-negotiable legal covenant. The clause stipulated that Aegis Dynamics held a non-exclusive operational license to deploy and commercialize the predictive engine only for the duration of my active employment with the company. Crucially, the agreement explicitly stated that in the event of an involuntary termination without cause, full exclusive ownership and commercial control of the patent would automatically revert to me within 24 hours of official notice. Over the subsequent decade, as Aegis Dynamics grew exponentially and underwent multiple rounds of venture capital financing, nobody in executive leadership ever conducted a thorough audit of the foundational intellectual property records. Senior executives cycled through the board. External legal counsel was replaced by massive law firms that only examined current employment contracts, and Julian Miller simply assumed that every piece of software belonged to the corporation by default. They viewed me as a permanent fixture of the building, a quiet legacy engineer who would work faithfully until retirement without ever asserting his rights. Sitting at my desk in the dim light of my office, I opened my personal laptop and sent an encrypted email to Walter Jennings, who was now living in semi-retirement on an alpaca ranch in Oregon. My message was simple: need immediate legal verification on reversion clause execution following involuntary termination without cause today. Less than 15 minutes later, my phone rang. Walter's voice came through the speaker, calm, deliberate, and entirely unbothered by corporate posturing. He informed me that he had already pulled the 2011 and cross-referenced contract and cross-referenced it with current federal intellectual property statutes, specifically 35 U.S.C. Section 271 governing patent infringement and 17 U.S.C. Section 106 regarding exclusive rights and copyrighted software. He confirmed that because Julian Miller had formally issued a termination notice without cause, the reversion covenant had been activated the instant. I packed my briefcase and walked out the door. Walter emphasized that under federal law, Aegis Dynamics' operational license would legally expire exactly 24 hours after the official timestamp of my termination. Once that window closed, any continued commercial deployment, server execution, or client demonstration of the predictive engine by Aegis Dynamics would constitute willful patent infringement. Willful infringement under federal statute carried catastrophic consequences, including statutory triple damages, personal executive liability, and immediate federal injunctions shutting down company operations. Walter asked if I wanted him to submit the formal reversion notice to the United States Patent and Trademark Office. I took a slow sip of bourbon and gave him the green light. By 5:45 in the morning, Walter Jennings had electronically transmitted the formal reversion documentation along with the notarized 2011 agreement through the United States Patent and Trademark Office portal. At 6:50 in the morning, the federal system officially verified and processed the filing, updating the public registry record in real time. Where the corporate ownership field had listed Aegis Dynamics Incorporated for over a decade, the public database now officially registered Gavin Vance as the sole legal owner of patent 79,864,322. While the morning sunlight gradually filled my kitchen, I sat at the island counter enjoying a fresh cup of dark roast coffee, monitoring the digital updates on my personal screen. Across town at Aegis Dynamics headquarters, executive leadership was preparing for what they believed would be the defining highlight of their fiscal year. Julian Miller had organized a massive product launch demonstrations scheduled for 10 o'clock that morning in the main corporate auditorium. Over 200 prominent venture capital partners, enterprise clients, and industry tech journalists had been invited to witness the live public debut of our next-generation software platform. A platform built entirely on my proprietary predictive engine. Julian had spent the preceding 3 weeks boasting about the event across major industry trade outlets, framing himself as the visionary executive who had modernized the firm's technological architecture. He had promised attendees a flawless live demonstration of real-time data analytics, completely oblivious to the fact that the underlying software running on his demonstration servers had legally ceased to be company property at 5:45 that morning. Every database query, every processing routine, and every analytical report executed by Aegis Dynamics was now an unauthorized commercial trespass on my personal intellectual property under 35 U.S.C. Section 271. As I watched the morning news, I could envision the scene taking place at corporate headquarters. Caterers were setting up elaborate breakfast spreads in the grand foyer, technical crews were adjusting spotlight rigs on stage, and public relations representatives were handing out glossy press packets featuring Julian's executive portrait. They were preparing to showcase a product worth hundreds of millions of dollars, completely unaware that the underlying intellectual foundation had just vanished from their corporate balance sheet. At 7:15 in the morning, my mobile phone began vibrating continuously on the granite countertop. I did not answer. I watched the screen illuminate with call after call from internal company extensions, human resources officers, and executive assistants. By 8:30 in the morning, my call log had registered 318 missed calls. Among them were 19 frantic voicemail messages from Julian Miller, whose voice degraded from aggressive corporate posturing in the earliest recordings to pure, unadulterated panic in the later messages. It turned out that a sharp junior associate in the corporate legal department had performed a routine intellectual property audit prior to the 10 o'clock auditorium presentation and discovered the updated Federal Registry entry. When the associate alerted the general counsel that Aegis Dynamics no longer possessed legal rights to their flagship software engine, shockwaves tore through the executive wing. The legal team instantly realized that if Julian proceeded with the live public demonstration, the company would be broadcasting direct evidence of willful patent infringement to an audience filled with corporate attorneys and major institutional investors. The legal team had frantically tried to contact Julian, who was in the middle of a pre-show wardrobe adjustment and refused to take calls until his assistant burst into the room, holding a printout of 35 U.S.C. Section 271. When Julian finally realized what had happened, he attempted to claim that it was a technical glitch in the government database. But as the minutes ticked down toward 10 o'clock, the legal team informed him that proceeding with the demonstration would carry immediate civil and criminal exposure for the board of directors. Julian had attempted to order the technical team to bypass the patent verification flags in the software build, but senior engineers refused to comply, citing potential criminal liability for unauthorized commercial execution of external software assets under federal law. The technical department was in a state of absolute revolt, with senior staff realizing that their VP of software strategy had unwittingly destroyed the legal standing of the entire product line. I listened to one of Julian's voicemails, where his tone cracked with desperation. He begged me to pick up the phone, offering to discuss consulting fees and equity adjustments if I would sign a temporary patent waiver before the presentation. It was pathetic to hear a man who had arrogant depissed 22 years of service, 24 hours earlier, now pleading for a legal lifeline. At 12 minutes past 9 in the morning, my phone rang once again. This time, the display showed the personal number of Howard Vance, the 68-year-old original founder of Aegis Dynamics. Howard had stepped away from daily operational management years ago to live on his private estate in Vermont, but he remained the company's largest individual shareholder and chairman of the board of directors. I let the phone ring 3 times before picking up the line and bringing the receiver to my ear without saying a word. "Gavin," Howard's voice thundered through the speaker, dense with gravel, exhaustion, and furious disbelief. He bypassed all corporate pleasantries and demanded to know why the United States Patent and Trademark Office was currently listing my personal name as the sole owner of the company's foundational technology platform. He demanded to know if there had been a catastrophic database corruption or if our legal department had committed an unimaginable clerical blunder during a system migration. I maintained a calm, steady tone, speaking as quietly as if we were discussing the morning weather forecast. I reminded Howard of that humid afternoon back in 2011 when he and I sat in a cramped booth eating cheap takeout after our initial venture capital deal collapsed. I reminded him that he had personally signed the conditional licensing agreement because Aegis Dynamics lacked the funds to purchase the patent rights from me at the time. I explained that the contract contained an explicit, non-negotiable covenant designed to protect my work if the company ever attempted to cast me aside without cause. I informed Howard that his newly appointed vice president of software strategy, Julian Miller, had summoned me into his corner office 24 hours earlier, scoffed at my 22 years of dedication, and informed me that if I was not happy with his vision, the door was right there. I explained that Julian had formally executed a termination notice without cause, thereby activating the automatic 24-hour reversion clause established under federal law. Howard went entirely silent on the line. For 6 long seconds, the only sound was his heavy breathing as the 68-year-old founder absorbed the sheer magnitude of the catastrophe. Howard slammed his fist onto his desk in Vermont, his voice trembling with anger as he realized the sheer incompetence of the management team he had installed to run the enterprise. He asked how Julian could have possibly committed such a monumental blunder without consulting legal counsel. I explained that Julian was so obsessed with executive alignment and quarterly optics that he never bothered to inspect the legal foundation of the system he was trying to manage. Howard groaned, admitting that hiring Julian was the single greatest mistake of his corporate career, driven by pressure from venture capital groups demanding a slick corporate face for public offerings. He realized that in their haste to modernize executive leadership, they had handed control of the company to someone who viewed technical assets as disposable commodities. When Howard spoke again, the thunder had completely vanished from his voice, replaced by a tight, strained tone of profound panic. He asked what terms I required to resolve the dispute before the 10 o'clock investor demonstration. I informed him that I had no intention of negotiating over a cellular connection and that any resolution would require a total restructuring of our commercial arrangement under formal legal supervision. I politely wished him a good morning, ended the call, and set my phone back on the counter as the clock ticked closer to 10 o'clock. Meanwhile, inside the main auditorium of Aegis Dynamics, complete chaos was breaking out in front of 200 invited guests. Less than 10 minutes before the presentation was scheduled to begin, Howard Vance arrived at corporate headquarters unannounced. Witnesses later recounted that the founder marched into the executive waiting area like a hurricane, confronting Julian Miller in front of the assembled board members and senior partners. When Julian attempted to brush off the patent reversion as a minor administrative technicality that could be ironed out later in arbitration, Howard reportedly slammed a printed copy of 35 U.S.C. Section 271 onto the table and shouted that Julian had just bankrupted the enterprise. The General Counsel formally warned the Board of Directors that proceeding with the live software demonstration would expose Aegis Dynamics to triple statutory damages for willful infringement under federal law. Left with zero legal alternative, Julian Miller was forced to step onto the auditorium stage in front of hundreds of key investors, corporate clients, and press reporters to announce that the product rollout had been indefinitely postponed due to unexpected legal verification procedures. The announcement triggered immediate shock, a sharp collapse in investor confidence, and an avalanche of demanding inquiries from institutional board members. As investors filed out of the auditorium in confusion, rumors began circulating through the hallways that the company's entire software platform was locked in a legal stranglehold. Institutional shareholders immediately began calling emergency meetings, demanding to know why the lead architect of the firm had been ousted 24 hours before the biggest product debut in company history. Julian Miller stood on the empty stage, sweating through his expensive suit, watching his corporate reputation dissolve in real time. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, an emergency session of the Aegis Dynamics Board of Directors was convened in the central conference room. Julian Miller was stripped of his management authority on the spot and instructed to wait in an empty cubicle while the board reviewed the firm's legal exposure. The General Counsel presented an exhaustive legal review of the 2011 conditional agreement, confirming to every board member present that my legal standing was absolute and unassailable. Under 35 U.S.C., Section 271 and 17 U.S.C. Section 106, Aegis Dynamics had no legal right to execute, license, or market the predictive engine without my explicit written authorization. Furthermore, the board's chief technical advisor admitted that attempting to rewrite 22 years of core architectural code from scratch would require at least 3 years of development and cost upwards of $40 million, effectively destroying the firm's market position while competitors captured our client base. They came to the stark realization that their entire $780 million enterprise hung by a single thread, and that thread was held by the 54-year-old engineer whom Julian Miller had arrogantly dismissed 24 hours earlier. The board members spent 2 hours arguing over their limited options, realizing that any attempt to fight the reversion in federal court would result in an immediate injunction freezing their servers and destroying their remaining market capitalization. Howard Vance looked around the table at the silent, pale executives and declared that there was only one path forward: total compliance with my terms. At 4:30 in the afternoon, Howard Vance personally transmitted a comprehensive settlement offer to my attorney, Walter Jennings. The board agreed to accept every single term I put forward without a single counter-proposal. Aegis Dynamics agreed to pay a lump sum retroactive royalty fee of $42 million for past commercial utilization of the core software engine. In addition, they established a permanent, non-exclusive licensing framework that guaranteed me an 8-figure annual royalty stream tied directly to gross corporate revenues. Crucially, the settlement agreements stipulated that I would be appointed to a permanent voting seat on the board of directors, ensuring that no arrogant manager could ever jeopardize the company's technical stability or mistreat veteran engineers again. Julian Miller was summarily terminated for gross executive negligence and breach of fiduciary duty under corporate law. His reputation in technology management permanently tarnished by his own unchecked hubris. The settlement also included strict non-disparagement covenants and an agreement that my name would be permanently restored to all executive documentation as the founding chief architect of Aegis Dynamics. The board realized that my presence on the governance committee was the only way to reassure skittish institutional investors that the company's technological foundation was once again secure. The legal documents were finalized and signed electronically by 6 o'clock that evening, bringing a swift and decisive conclusion to the 24-hour corporate standoff. I poured myself another glass of bourbon, sat out on my back porch in the cool evening air, and watched the stars come out over the city, feeling a profound sense of closure and peace. The following morning, I returned to Aegis Dynamics headquarters not as an employee seeking approval, but as a board member and sole patent owner of the firm's core technology. As I walked through the glass doors of the lobby, the atmosphere was quiet and deeply respectful. Senior engineers and staff members who had watched me leave 24 hours earlier offered warm nods of appreciation, knowing that the foundation of their work had been restored by someone who truly valued their craft. I walked down the quiet executive corridor toward the corner office that had briefly belonged to Julian Miller. Facilities workers were already packing his personal items into cardboard boxes, removing his brass doorplate and preparing the space for new leadership. I stood in the doorway for a quiet moment, looking at the mahogany desk where he had scoffed at my 22 years of service. I felt no urge for loud celebration or petty spite. I simply felt the deep, enduring satisfaction of a master builder who had constructed a fortress and protected it with foresight, patience, and unyielding legal precision. In corporate America, young managers often mistake quiet dedication for weakness, assuming that experience can be easily discarded in favor of buzzwords and superficial speed. But real power does not reside in temporary executive titles or polished slide decks. Real power belongs to the architects who understand how the system is built, who maintain control over the underlying blueprints, and who possess the wisdom to protect what is rightfully theirs.